Hi friends, so there was a journalist, his last name's Dimmock, he's English, and he received this reply to a letter that he sent Julian Assange in the Belmarsh prison, that high maximum security prison, which is really awful. And I wanted to share it with you, and he said, Julian Assange said, sorry about the wind by the way, I thought I'd do this outside, but just because it's so nice out here, but then occasionally being on an island like Tasmania we get gusts of wind. It says, Julian Assange says, I've been isolated from an ability to prepare to defend myself. No laptop, no internet, ever. No computer, no library so far. But even if I get access, it will just be for a half an hour with everyone else once a week. The other side, a superpower that has been preparing for 9 years with hundreds of people and untold millions spent on the case. I am defenseless. I am unbroken, albeit literally surrounded by murderers. But the days where I could read and speak and organize to defend myself, my ideals and my people are over until I am free. Everyone else must take my place. The US government, or rather those regrettable elements in it that hate truth, liberty and justice, want to cheat their way into my extradition and death, rather than letting the public hear the truth, for which I have won the highest award in awards in journalism and have been nominated 7 times for a Nobel Peace Prize. Truth ultimately is all we have. So I think that's the whole letter that Julian Assange replied to Mr. Dimmock, who's also a journalist. And you can find Mr. Dimmock's video on that online. And I wanted to also just go through some of the points that Ben Norton from the Grey Zone Project, who speaks about Julian Assange, and the title of the essay is Trump's Charges Against Assange Are Historic, Attacks on Press Freedoms, Media and Obama Help Set the Stage. And he said it's not just Trump, but the media, Obama, Bush, mainstream, quote-unquote human rights organizations, Republicans and Democrats alike, that put the noose around the neck of Wikileaks publisher Julian Assange, threatening all journalists. Before I share a few points from that, I wanted to just talk about how I've noticed the mainstream media is suddenly, as at the 11th hour, is suddenly freaking out a little bit about what this means for journalists worldwide, and how Julian Assange is really just doing journalism, and now it's being criminalized by the Trump administration. And with these 17 charges that will bring 175 years for Mr. Assange if he's extradited to the US. And this is all for the crime, in quotes, of journalism. So the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention has declared multiple times that Assange has been unjustly detained for the past 7 years and must be freed and given compensation. The Wikileaks responded to this 175 years that Assange is facing if he's extradited. They posted, they've said Wikileaks responds to Espionage Act indictment against Assange, unprecedented attack on free press. The ACLU said, breaking, for the first time in the history of our country, the government has brought criminal charges under the Espionage Act against a publisher for the publication of truthful information. This is a direct assault on the First Amendment. And I've noticed that, as I was just about to say, I've noticed that the New York Times, there's a few Murdoch press outlets that have been questioning this unfortunate move by the Trump administration to basically destroy the First Amendment and a direct attack on journalism and press freedom. You know, it's interesting how, as I mentioned, at the 11th hour, all these various journalists, and I use that word lightly, they're stenographers really, all these stenographers and government puppets who have been hawking the Russiagate narrative even after it's been proven false that there hasn't been any collusion between Trump and the Russian government, and have been promoting this idea that Julian Assange and Wikileaks have helped usher in a Manchurian candidate, Donald Trump, on behalf of Russia, and so suddenly they've got, basically Russia running the country. All this sort of nonsense. One of the cheerleaders of that, of course, is Rachel Maddow. And I had a look at, I've never watched Rachel Maddow for a long time, since she's just gone right off the rails with her absolutely ridiculous Russiagate nonsense. But she's decided that this mightn't be a very good thing for her. Also, I think she's got another thing that she can go on about, which I guess is better than Russiagate, but something to attack Trump with, of course. It's not really about Julian Assange, and I'm not even sure how much it's about press freedom for her, because she long ago abandoned journalism. But anyway, she mentioned it, which is good, Rachel Maddow on MSNBC, which some call the Clinton Network, I think. Or was that CNN, the Clinton News Network? Anyway, so Rachel Maddow was started, even though she was promoting more nonsense about WikiLeaks being helping Trump get into office as a Manchurian candidate for Russia, even though Rachel Maddow has been pushing the Russiagate narrative still, she managed to agree that this is an attack on journalism and that all journalists should be fearful of this. And of course she had to go at Julian Assange and sort of, I mean, it's excruciating watching her, really. But this is the state of, journalism, in quotes. This is the state of journalism today. There's a whole bunch of stenographers that are just pushing the government talking points, the CIA talking points now. And this is really actually one of the reasons why, which Ben Norton talks about in his piece, which I invite people to read. It's a really good one, as all his pieces are. It's in the Grey Zone Project, and Ben talks about how, the mainstream media is responsible in great part for what's happening to Julian Assange. And so, because the Fourth Estate is in great part responsible for what's happening to Julian Assange, it's suddenly they realize that they themselves, not that they ever really release any information that's of any real benefit to anybody, they're just busy promoting nonsense and propaganda and warmongering, war propaganda for the national security state. But they do realize they've got some sort of introspection or insight into what's happening, and realize that they could be on the list of people who could be imprisoned for literally just being a journalist, because ultimately that's all that WikiLeaks and Julian Assange have been in the case in particular. They share information that's in the public interest about war crimes and political corruption. That's what journalism is supposed to be doing. And all these journalists, I use that word lightly, don't seem to even know what journalism is now. But people like Rachel Maddow get $30,000 a day for promoting nonsense like Russiagate. So, but interestingly, they've suddenly realized that their heads are on the chopping block too in the future. It's not about saving this man's life to them, which I think everybody should be interested in. He's a hero. He's been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, although the Nobel Peace Prize has been given to Obama, so I'm not sure really if that's anything to be excited about, but he's been nominated for that. He's won lots of journalism awards. And sadly, organizations like Amnesty International, who promote Syria nonsense like that awful human slaughterhouse story they wrote, which has never been proven, the investigation, which has never been proven. They basically are a puppet of the government, and Human Rights Watch. Organizations like that should be ashamed of themselves, and they have not bothered with Julian Assange. But the UN, the rapporteur on torture, has been to see Julian Assange. This is a major issue. So Ben Norton, he says, Julian Assange is facing 17 charges under the United States Espionage Act, a draconian law that was written during World War I to imprison leftists who spoke out against the mass slaughter. Well, actually, I didn't know that about the Espionage Act. I didn't know that it was actually targeting leftists who spoke out against mass slaughter. So how appropriate is it that they're using this against Julian Assange? So it says, how fitting then that after that 100 years later, this same ruthless statute is being used to muzzle the man who has done more than any other person alive to expose the misdeeds of the U.S. national security state. In its relentless assault on civil liberties, the Donald Trump administration has the dubious distinction of breaking two records at once, indicting a journalist under the Espionage Act the first time and indicting a non-U.S. citizen. Yeah, I find this the fact that this is an Australian citizen, and they're going to extradite this Australian citizen to the United States. And of course, I've spoken previously about my disgust for the Australian government, my government, who has completely abandoned Julian Assange, and still no mention of him. You can say stuff on Twitter to Anthony Albanese from the Labor Party, or Senator Penny Wong from the Labor Party, or even the Greens. The Greens are silent now. The Green Party. Of course, you wouldn't expect any better from the Scott Morrison government. They're a full-on right-wing, racist, Islamophobic, journalist-hating, neo-conservative, awful government who doesn't care about climate change, basically. So it's not surprising. But all these politicians, really, and even the couple of the Greens that have spoken out just before the election have been quiet. This is the state of our so-called leaders in this country. These politicians have completely abandoned him. So Ben Norton goes on to say, it is far from hyperbole to say that the US government's campaign against Julian Assange is one of the gravest threats to press freedoms in modern history. Quote unquote, "This is madness," wrote Wikileaks in response to the news of the indictment. "It is the end of national security journalism and the First Amendment." And he goes on to talk about how the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, said this, he must be freed and given compensation. But now Julian Assange could languish in an American dungeon for several lifetimes. Quote, "The war on Julian Assange is now a war on all," end quote, cautioned renowned journalist John Pilger. Quote, "The target today is Assange. Tomorrow it will be you on the New York Times, you on the ABC. Modern fascism is breaking cover," end quote. That's John Pilger, who basically, he's a great Australian journalist, and he's being ignored by most other journalists in Australia and by the government, by politicians. And here comes Nandi, or is that? Here's Nandi. He's wearing a Bird Be Safe collar. No, we don't like to dress up our cats. So anyway, so I invite you to read that article by Ben Norton. It goes on, and it talks about, it says the New York Times has spent the past few years lying about Assange, smearing him and WikiLeaks as supposed Russian tools in neo-McCarthyite screeds that are filled to the brim with insinuation and quotes from anonymous US government officials, but light on actual evidence. So, and he said even the Times has come to the rude awakening, warning in a report the night the additional 17 charges were announced, that it is, quote, "a novel case that raises profound First Amendment issues, a case that could open the door to criminalizing activities that are crucial to American investigative journalists who write about national security matters," end quote. This is the same paper, the New York Times, who's just rubbish now. But it was the one, I think, that released the Pentagon Papers. And they did that movie, The Post, which I haven't seen, with Meryl Streep. But that's the thing. It's if the Pentagon Papers had been released now, the Pentagon Papers were released by whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg. And if the Pentagon Papers had been released now, whoever was the journalist who helped, who published that, and the newspaper would be suffering the same fate as Julian Assange. That's what the New York Times is probably waking up to. They've done nothing but rubbish him. Pretty much all mainstream media has been rubbishing Julian Assange for the last 7 years and smearing him, making up all sorts of dreadful lies about his time in the Ecuadorian embassy as well. That lies about lies about Assange smearing feces on the wall of the Ecuadorian embassy, when there's somebody who worked in the Ecuadorian embassy for 7 years and said he was only 100% respectful to all Ecuadorian embassy staff And none of that ever took place. And if they wanted to prove that, they could have, since they've been filming everything that he's been doing for some time now, and spying on him, and even spying on him being his doctor's appointments, everything. Since they've been doing all of that, I'm sure they could easily show where he's been smearing feces, where he was smearing feces on the wall of the Ecuadorian embassy. Seriously. So that's the level of disgusting, quote-unquote, journalism that the mainstream media has been doing about Julian Assange. And now they're all starting to freak out because they realize that their heads one day could be on the chopping block. Well, isn't this interesting that it's taken that for them to suddenly say something? All this time, just smearing him and belittling Julian Assange. And this is not just about Julian Assange. This is about press freedom, period. The irony of Rachel Maddow saying, how he's been sort of reduced to this sort of dislikable character. Well, she helped do that, and so did all the mainstream media. And the irony about Rachel Maddow saying that Julian Assange has been reduced to this kind of dislikable character, but she and all the mainstream media have reduced him to that, so that he would not get any sort of hearing. And Rachel Maddow still, instead of acknowledging that the Podesta emails that were released by Wikileaks, which were about Hillary Clinton and her corruption, she still won't acknowledge that, and she still won't acknowledge that it was really a leak and not a hack. It wasn't a hack. And NSA William Binney, who's also a whistleblower, he was high up in the NSA. He said it was not a hack, it was a leak. And anybody could tell that, who knows anything about that sort of thing, could tell that in a New York minute. So she refuses to acknowledge what really happened there, would rather promote this nonsense, Russiagate nonsense. And that's what's helped bring this issue to its conclusion. Real journalists are being vilified by pretend journalists who are just stenographers and puppets for the corporate national security state. And that's what's happening to Julian Assange. He is a victim of this so-called profession of journalism, in quotes. And then Ben Norton says how, in a characteristically convoluted paragraph, the New York Times reluctantly acknowledged, quote, "Though Assange is not a conventional journalist, much of what Mr. Assange does at Wikileaks is difficult to distinguish in a legally meaningful way from what traditional news organizations like the Times do. Seek and publish information that officials want to be secret, including classified national security matters, and take steps to protect the confidentiality of sources," end quote. To be honest, I'm actually surprised that New York Times and Rachel Maddow and all these people have even had the wisdom or the wherewithal to actually realize how bad this is for them and how bad it could be for them, because they've just been so rabid with all the Russiagate nonsense and promoting war for the national security state. I'm surprised they've actually had the wherewithal to sort of comment and push back a little bit on this, but it's too little too late in a way. And CNN and NPR have been trying to make out, I think, that Julian Assange is not a journalist. I mean, this is the sort of nonsense. So Ben goes on to say, and it was not just the corporate media that helped set the stage for Trump locking up a foreign journalist. The US war on dissident journalism, like most American wars, has been thoroughly bipartisan. The assault on civil liberties began with George W. Bush and his fake quote-unquote war on terror. Barack Obama then expanded the crackdown by using the Espionage Act to charge more whistleblowers who leaked information to journalists than all previous presidents combined. Journalist James Risen, who was himself a target of this Obama administration repression, wrote in the New York Times in 2016, quote, "If Donald J. Trump decides as president to throw a whistleblower in jail for trying to talk to a reporter, he will have one man to thank for bequeathing him such expansive power, Barack Obama." And Ben goes on to say, put more simply, the authoritarianism is bipartisan. The brazen attack on Assange is one of many promises broken by Trump, who affirmed during his 2016 campaign, "I love WikiLeaks." But it is much too easy to put all the blame on the bigoted bogeyman. The tragic truth is that the blame goes around. The reality is that President Hillary Clinton would have launched this same full-fledged attack on press freedoms. The Democratic presidential candidate put her stamp of approval on Britain's arrest of the WikiLeaks publisher this April, insisting, quote, "He has to answer for what he has done," end quote. Yes, he has to answer for being a journalist. The reality is, so too would a future President Joe Biden, who as Vice President under Obama dubbed Assange, quote, a high-tech terrorist, end quote, and mulled over prosecuting. And I invite you to check out Media Roots Radio and their recent thing about Julian Assange, their recent thing about Joe Biden and how he's more of a horror story than Hillary Clinton. Ben posts a tweet by Edward Snowden. The Department of Justice just declared war, not on Wikileaks, but on journalism itself. This is no longer about Julian Assange. The case will decide the future of media, end quote. So Ben winds it up saying, as journalists in the US and around the world now stare down the barrel of a gun, it must be said clearly, everyone who demonized Wikileaks and Julian Assange put the ammo in the weapon, paving the way for Trump's historic attack on press freedoms, including and especially the media itself, although truthfully, it was not just the corporate media that smeared Julian Assange. Even some progressive alternative media outlets played a role. Yes, I can attest to that one. I've seen that. The self-declared anti-Trump quote-unquote resistance likewise poured fuel on the anti-WikiLeaks fire, risking serious damage to the public's civil liberties for short-term political gain. Certainly the Trump administration and the far right, the president himself are committing the crime. They will be the ones to pull the trigger in this unspeakable offense. But the media, Obama, Bush, mainstream quote-unquote human rights organizations, and a sizable majority of Republicans and Democrat politicians alike put the gun in Donald Trump's hand. That's what. I read on bits and pieces of Ben Norton's piece, which is in the Grey Zone Project. Ben Norton is a journalist and writer. He is a reporter for the Grey Zone and the producer of Moderate Rebels podcast, which he hosts with Max Blumenthal. His website is bennorton.com, and he tweets at Benjamin Norton. So anyway, and unfortunately, Bernie Sanders hasn't really said anything about Julian Assange at all. And it's only just recently, I think this is because the MSNBC has decided to say something, and Rachel Maddow has decided to say something, that he thinks it's safe to do so. I'm not going to comment on what I think about that. I think you can infer what you like from that. Bernie Sanders says, let me be clear, it is a disturbing attack on the First Amendment for the Trump administration to decide who is or is not a reporter for the purposes of a criminal prosecution. Donald Trump must obey the Constitution, which protects the publication of news about our government. And he retweets the ACLU tweet about for the first time in history, and I read that just before. Tulsi Gabbard, of course, has been outspoken about this. I've done videos about Tulsi Gabbard and some of the problems I have with her foreign policy. But in this case, she's particularly clear, and she says, charging Assange under the Espionage Act will have a serious chilling effect on our most fundamental rights of freedom of speech and freedom of the press. Every American, certainly every journalist, must strongly condemn this anti-democratic act by the Trump administration. So at least Tulsi Gabbard is actually being very clear about this very, very important issue. You know, this really is, as I've said before, you know, we're not just sauntering towards fascism now. It's sort of a gallop, and unfortunately, both major parties in the U.S. are problematic in this way. It's just that Trump has a more crass way of going about this. He's the mask of the empire pulled off, basically. But this would be something, as Ben Norton set out, there's something that Hillary Clinton would have done, and Joe Biden. I don't expect that if Joe Biden gets in that he will help Julian Assange whatsoever. I would like to think that somebody would pardon him, not that he needs pardoning, but I would like to think somebody would, but I don't see that happening. So anyway, he's going to die in that UK prison or in an American solitary confinement under torture and all sorts of things. He'll spend the rest of his life there if he's extradited to the US, and it's an absolutely appalling thing that this is happening. I feel so awful that this particular man, I feel so awful that a human being has been abandoned, not only by the mainstream media, his supposed colleagues, but also by my government, which I'm most disappointed about and most disgusted about. And I have expressed my disgust numerous times on this channel on Faint Signals from Vega, and it makes me, it sort of, I will never forgive this Australian government, either party, either major party or the Greens, for their lack of effort and their lack of speaking out about this. I will never forgive any of them for this. It's appalling. And he is likely, if the British government, if the British legal system is not fair, he is likely to be extradited, and that will be the end of him. If he doesn't die in this Belmarsh prison because he's not very well after 7 years in the Ecuadorian embassy, where he couldn't get any sunlight and he couldn't get any medical attention and so forth, he's not in a very good way. And even though he might be psychologically handling it, physically, I don't think that one can just go on and on and on with the kind of harsh conditions that are in Belmarsh prison after spending 7 years in a small room without any exercise, without any proper exercise or sunlight, and without any proper way of just living, being a normal person. So they're trying to kill him in these various prisons, and by abandoning him in the Ecuadorian embassy, but in this Belmarsh prison, and they will try and kill him by throwing him away. It's to make an example of him, so that no other journalist ever, or no other publisher ever does anything like what they did, releasing information about war crimes and political corruption, or like the Pentagon Papers. As Daniel Ellsberg said, he said if this was now and he'd release the Pentagon Papers, they would throw him in prison and throw away the key. And his release of that information helped end the Vietnam War. That was one of the reasons the Vietnam War came to an end. So anyway, that's all I wanted to say, so thank you so much for watching. Please do what you can. Write to Julian Assange in prison. There's restrictions on what you can send him, so you might want to look up. I'll see if I can leave the information about, you can actually see a website called writetojulian.com, I think it is, and it gives instructions on what you should and shouldn't do when you're writing letters to him. I think you have to handwrite them and all of that, and you can't send anything. You can't send books or magazines or anything like that. You literally, I think, have to handwrite stuff. The same with Chelsea Manning. Anyway, so write to him, but also push your government officials to speak out about this and say, look, I'm not going to vote for you if you're silent about this. Spread information from independent journalists about this. There's a whole bunch of things you can do, and that we have to just keep pushing for this, because once he is extradited, that's like almost like the last nail in the coffin for any remnant of free press. They can do that to anybody in the future, from anywhere. You don't have to be a US citizen. Okay, thanks so much for watching. Please hit the subscribe button if you like the content. Please hit the notifications bell and the like bell if you like the content. And please always leave comments if you feel like it. I always appreciate them. And thanks so much for watching. My name's Trish Roberts. You're watching Faint Signals from Vega. And sorry about the audio, the blowing wind. Unfortunately, I couldn't do anything about that. I tried to pause so the wind would pass along. The breeze wouldn't hit the microphone outlet, but I'm not sure if that was successful. Anyway, so thanks for watching. Bye for now.